Okay, so this tutorial is on using NS date and string and going back and forth between the two. What we're going to do is take a date from the current date, write it to a date variable. Take the date, parse it out into string, and put the string essentially onto the screen. Just a little exercise to kind of show you, again, give you a little bit more practice in working with the date format and also with strings. Because believe it or not, you're working a lot with strings in most of the development work that you're doing. So go ahead and create a brand new single view application and call it anything you want. I'm going to call mine date, NS date, so I'll call it date. So single view application, go ahead and click on next. I'm going to call mine a date example. And then go ahead and click on next and finish, create it, put it on the desktop so you can just throw it away if you want to when you're done with it. And then go ahead and click on the XIB file, the interface file. I always do the interface first. You don't necessarily have to follow this pattern, but it seems to work out better for me. Add 7 labels to the view and 2 buttons, so it looks like this. So we got 2 buttons. One's going to get today's date, the other one's going to parse the date. You can make it look any way you want, actually. So let's see, why does this look so big? No, it's the document itself. So let's go this way. Oh, that looks better. Okay. Oh, that's even better. Okay, good. So let me make that. So let's see what I got here. I'm going to put the 2 buttons on there first. So this one's going to be get date, and this one underneath is going to be parse date. And then I'm going to put the date somewhere. So I'm going to drag a bunch of labels on here because I'm going to have month, day. Let's see. I'll put it in here and go here. This is the current date. And I'll stretch this out a little bit. And let's see. We'll center it. Make the font a little bit bigger. That looks pretty good. And let me go back and see what I've got here. Today's date, parse date. Looks pretty good. And then year, month, day, hours, and minutes. So year, month, day, hours, and minutes. Year, month, day, hours, and minutes. Day, hours, oops, minutes, and then what's on the bottom here? There's something on the bottom of the screen here. Today's complete date. I don't think I actually use that for anything, but I'll put it out there anyway, just in case. Actually, I think it's just putting the date in 2 spots. Today's complete date. Alright. It's a lot of labels because we're going to take and we're going to parse out the string and we're going to put in all these different labels. So what we're going to do is basically parse the string out and separate it out into all of the different subcomponents that belong to it. And I'm going to change my background because I don't like that ugly gray. So make this one gold color. Alright, so I've got my user interface, how beautiful it looks. I'm going to go ahead and click on the editor here and start wiring the components. And when I wire the components, I'm going to use the names that I've used in here. So now I can make this bigger again. So let's see, we're going to be date label, date complete label, that's the one on the bottom, year, month. Okay, so the date label is going to be the one on the top. So I'll do that one first. This guy here is going to be the date label. So I'm going to make a property out of here and call it date label. And so let's see what we've got next. We're going to have year, month, day, probably following that yet. No, the one on the bottom, date. Let me see, I'm going to copy this one here. So then when you have the one on the bottom is the date complete label. So I don't know if we're actually using that for anything, but we'll see anyway.
Is that a reassembly?
Yeah, we're going to put it back together. Yeah. So the idea here is to take the date, turn it into a string, take the substring parts of it, lay it all out, and then put it all back together. It's kind of pointless in terms of an application design, but it kind of demonstrates how to break a string out and use it for data. Because essentially you're using this a lot in most of your input-output that's going on, especially if you start looking at dates. And we'll see next week we have another one that does notifications, unless we do it in the iOS class later. It's kind of working on the same concept. But then we can use the information as we see fit. So, alright, so we're going to have year, month, day, hours, and minutes, all followed by label. So that's pretty easy. Year label. Month label. I'm actually just pressing return and it's making it for me automatically. Day label. And hours and minutes. This stuff should be hopefully pretty easy for you right now. Hours. Is it hour label? Or is it hours? I can always change it. I used hour, singular, hour and minute. So hour label. And then I'm going to have minute label. Minute label. Alright. So then we're also going to put in another one. We're going to put another property for NSString, today's date. And then we're going to have our two touch up and sides or touch down or however you want to label or whichever event you'd like to do for your buttons. We're going to have a get today's date and a parse date. So I'm going to manually just put this today's date in there. It's not attached to any of the GUI components. So I'm going to stick it on the top so I can remember what it is. And then I put these guys grouped together so I know that they're all going to the GUIs. And then I'm going to wire now, before the end, down on the bottom here, I'm going to put my two buttons together. You don't have to do it this way. I'm actually kind of showing you my own design pattern, how I organize my code, actually. And everyone was going to have a different organization, maybe some similarities. So what are we supposed to call this one? Get today's date? Something like that? It doesn't really matter, I can always change it in the code. I believe I called it get today's date, right? And then parse date. Perfect. That's a long name. I usually don't go that long. And then this other one's going to be parse date. So I'm going to do the touch up inside, parse date. So on a final exam, if I mentioned something about wiring the components, you'd know what that meant, hopefully. If I said something about doing this dot text, you'd know what that meant, hopefully. You'd know that what these properties were representing. We only have about 4 weeks left, so I'm getting there. 4 or 5 weeks left. We're getting close to the end. That's why I'm like preparing you for the final. All right, so this was the .h, so we're going to go to the .m. And if I asked you a question about properties, what's the flip side of that? It's synthesize. What is the synthesize doing? What else is it giving us?
You can access
setters and getters. Yeah, it's if it was a multiple choice question and it asked you, one of the options was it's creating setters and getters for you. That would, and it's also making it visible. What does putting it in here do? Makes it public, makes it visible. So over here, I always come up to the top and I always remove the interface that appears. And an interface that appears inside of an implementation is for private declarations of data being used only in the implementation. Yeah. So if we property one, we're going to synthesize something. And so maybe I can just cut and paste the entire line, actually. I can. Look at that. And I can test to see if I called everything the same way I was supposed to call it. So we synthesize all of the data that we would create properties for, which we just did, and now I have something spelled wrong. Today's I think I had a T maybe here. Today's date. Let's take a look here. Oh, I have a line return is what the problem is. There we go. Oh, I did spell my things correctly because my synthesized work. So everything is spelled correctly. All right, very good. So still in the viewController.m, we're going to implement the get today's date, which is the reason why we're doing this actually. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an NSDate formatter. So it's another object called NSDate formatter that we're going to use to hold the date, and we're going to set the format we want for the date to be displayed as. So we're going to set the time zone. We're on the Pacific time zone. So we're in the United States on Pacific Daylight Time, which is going to be an hour off from Standard Time. It just happens to be on Daylight Time, so we're in luck. We don't have to change it. Which is 25,200 seconds, or 7 hours earlier than GMT. So the time on the date is GMT. You actually have to minus the hours to get to your time zone date. And the date is actually set on the emulator. So if we got the date from the emulator, we'd actually get the date that we're going to get in GMT and then convert it. So after we have our formatter set up, we're going to get today's date and we're going to stick it in the NS string that we've created. So this is going to hold it's going to be held when we start the string, when we set the string for the date label. So the button that says get today's date is a button that's going to create an NSDate formatter to use for our dates. So here's the code here. NSDate formatter is the name of the object that we're creating. The name of the object instance that we're creating is called formatter. It is of object type NSDate formatter. And that's going to be equal to, and this should look familiar, NSDate formatter.alloc in it. So if I showed you this code here on the final exam and I said, what is that doing? Yeah, I know. You don't have to answer all these questions. You already know the answer to this. And these are the typical questions I'm going to ask you, by the way. Or, you know, if you had code that said, you know, run the method setDateFormat with this particular string, which one of the following method calls would be performing this operation? I'll write one in C++, I'll write one in Java, and I'll write one like this in Objective-C. And you'll have to pick out this one as the correct answer. Or maybe there'll be 3 in Objective-C, but this will be like a dot or something, or it'll be in a totally different format. So the purpose of the final is going to be so that you can actually recognize Objective-C code, know the format of how to run a method, how to create an instance of an object, how to allocate an object, how to initialize an object, how to run a constructor, how to run an initializer with parameters on an object. Not necessarily instant recall on all the different types of objects. In fact, if you were to ask me what all the different types of objects were, I wouldn't be able to answer that question. It's like unlimited. It's like thousands of different types of objects. But knowing how to run a method on an object, it's pretty good. You should know that. Okay, so, and a method in general, method syntax. So programming language syntax. Let me just say that. So here is another method we're running to set the time zone. So we're setting the date format, we're setting the time zone, and we're setting the time zone using an NS timezone object. That's going to set the time zone. That's going to be time zone for seconds from GMT, and then the parameter we're sending it is negative 25,200 because we're that many seconds minus GMT, 7 hours before GMT, or that time that we're going to get back from GMT. That's going to give us our Pacific Daylight Time. And then we're going to create a string of the current date and time here. We're using an NSDate formatter at today's date. That's that variable, I believe, that we created. That's going to be equal to the formatter string from date NSDate date. We know we can get the date this way. If we get the date this way and we try to just add it to a string, we're going to have a problem because it's a date, not a string. So we know that we're going to convert the date to a string. So we know that we have a string from date, we have a string from integer, a string from float, string from double, all these different built-in methods that help us with formatting. We could have easily just taken date label.text and have it equal to this, instead of having it equal to this, but we did it in two separate steps. We could have combined the two statements together. We didn't necessarily need to use that, but then I wouldn't be showing you how to use a variable. So here's the same code again, creating the NSDate for the string using our NSDate formatter. We're going to basically take the date, put it into a string, put it on a label, and then convert it back to a date. So we're taking the string now, we're going to convert it back to a date, and now that's where we get the date from string that's going to be formatted and just put into our NS log. So if I cut and paste this, because what we're doing is just, it's kind of pointless, but we're taking a date, converting it to a string, taking the string, converting it back to a date. Just so we can see how a string and a date can be converted back and forth. Gives you more exposure to data conversion. So this is the method, and it should work to put the date onto the screen to get today's date. So I'm going to cut and paste them. I'm going to stick this in the implementation of the button that says get today's date. What I should do is have you guys actually write methods. That would be a good thing. That would be the true test. Let's see. But then that would be hard to grade, hard thing to grade. So. Let's see. So let's see. We're testing the top button. It says get date to make sure that the date is actually going to be written to the current date label. So I say this is a pretty easy tutorial actually. The ones for today are super easy. Because I've had a long weekend. I can't handle anything more complicated. Alright. Is it? Yeah. Well then that's good. Because then you'll be able to do it. Oh, you did it already? Oh, you did it already. I'll say half the class hasn't done it yet. So. Alright, so you see my date example. What have we got in here? It's being printed in my NS log, and my date's being printed out here. 1720. Well, it's in military time. So subtract 12 hours from it. So. Actually, it was the alarm clock. We did this already, you're right. But we didn't actually convert it to a string and take it from a string and put it back, did we? Yeah, maybe we did. So might be a little overlap with another one. So we didn't do this part, though. We didn't parse it out, did we? Yeah. Okay, so I don't think we did. So the last thing we're going to do is implement the parse state. The parse state is really simple, actually. This is actually kind of the interesting part of parsing. We have an NS string we're going to call year. We have an NS string for month, NS string for day, hour, minute. And then we're going to take the today's date, which is a string. So this is the string parsing thing that I wanted to show you out of here. So instead of taking an array of characters and going through a loop and parsing it out that way, or instead of delimiting it or running a string method on it, instead we're going to take and run this method. It says substring with range, and then we're going to do an NS make range, which is an interesting approach, which is the way you're going to do it here. So from 6 to 4, so starting at 6, going 4 characters, we're going to make that one the year. Year's at the end of it, actually. The first one actually is going to be the month, day, year. So the month is going to start with 0, go 2 characters, so 03. And then the day, from 3 to another 2. And then from hour, and then minutes. So don't be afraid to use this kind of a thing for a date to figure out how many hours from now, how many minutes from now, how many seconds. We didn't do the notification one, did we? No. Okay, because I have the one that follows this one is going to put up a notification send a notification for an alarm. So you're going to set, a message, note to self, 2 hours from now, tell me I need to go to lunch. And so it'll send a pop-up message or a notification or email or whatever you want it to do, actually. We're going to send email in iOS today, so you figure out how to do that. And then send yourself an email message at lunchtime. Hey, time to go to lunch. Okay. By keeping track of the hours and minutes and seconds and then time between each one. So this was the predecessor to that one. Although you don't have to save this project. It's built in as a separate project. But anyway, this is a nifty way of parsing a string. This is an NS string, and we're using a substring with range on it. And then we have a minute label.text is equal to minutes. And we have hours.text is equal to hours, and here we go, day, hours, and minutes. So we're just setting it to each individual component that we're getting. And then we're going to create an NSDate object from the NSDate components. Well, I don't have to do this, but we're taking it, separating it all out, and then we're putting it all back together. So it's the exact opposite. So we're going to create a date string out of this that's compatible with the date format. So we have the NSDate components. So we're going to allocate and initialize a new components object. Component set year to the year in value, month in value, day in value, year in value. That's going to be for the year, month, day, hour, minutes, and then the GMT time setting at 0. We're going to take the NS calendar object and create a calendar, allocate it, initialize it with the NS regular standard calendar that we're going to use. I can never say that word. Gregory calendar, our standard de facto calendar that we're using. And then the NS date is going to be equal to date 1, which is going to be the date from components that we're going to do. And the components are going to be added from the components that we created. So we just did nothing more than taking the strings that we took all apart, we put them all back together, and I believe we're going to put that on the bottom. So I need to format it again to convert our date to a string. So we take, after we took the date, separated it out into strings, put the strings, put it back into a date. Now we're going to take the date, convert it to a string. So we can put it on a label. So date formatter here is going to be a new formatter, initialize it, give it this format, and then give it to date. So then we're going to set the date complete label to this date that we've created from the components that we took apart and put back together. Turned it into a date, and then took the date, turned it back into a string. So if you ever have any doubts on how to work with dates, this is going to do everything for you. Should have no more doubts after this. It's about everything you can possibly do with a date and a string. And then as a comment on the bottom says, that's all we're done. We did a lot of extra stuff just for demonstration of getting a date, but maybe you can learn something from this. So it's not necessarily going to be a most beautiful application here, but let's see, parse date. You can test it out. You can use this one as an example for date conversions, stuff like that. How did I get 2 semicolons at the end? That's an interesting phenomena. I have 2 of them at the end. Interesting. Okay. Only need 1 semicolon at the end. Let's see. It does build. That's good. I took the extra semicolon off. I'm not quite sure how we got 2 semicolons at the end of it. So now the parse date should work, but the parse date's not going to work unless we get the date. This is not going to have anything. Well, actually, that's a good question. I can't remember if it's reading it from. It isn't. It's not reading it. It's empty. Parse date's reading it from the current date. Now we can parse the date. So it's reading this guy here as the string, and when the string wasn't a date, it didn't know what to do with it. So, and then we have the date again down here. It looks pretty good. It's the same date. So the year, the month, the day, the hours, and the minutes. So the minutes should change on us, but eventually. After a minute, perhaps. All right, that's everything you ever wanted to know about parsing strings, dates to strings. So we'll take a short break, and then we'll go into the Twitter and mail. Sending mail, send mail, because someone said we didn't do the send mail.
Yeah.